We're currently commemorating the 40th anniversary of the ACP group, and this is also the 40th anniversary of Mozambique too. So it's a great honor for me to be here today, and I think that choosing today to reflect upon the opportunities offered to us by the future is an excellent idea, as well as looking at the challenges facing us in various sectors. This is something that we've already touched upon in some of the panel discussions, but this afternoon we'll be focusing on a major challenge, which is the future of the ACP group in terms of trade, investment, development, and partnerships, as well as looking at the dynamics and the challenges that are required for the ACP to play a role in world governance, what the prospects are for change before us, in particular if we take into account what we have heard in terms of what our partners have said. And I think that we have always said that in future what we wanted was a partnership with the European Union, but also with other partners too. So I don't think that that's anything new for anybody. But we're also going to be looking at the impact of globalisation and prospects for small states. In the panel discussion this afternoon, we're going to have eminent researchers speaking, eminent figures from research institutes, because having heard from countries, it's very useful to hear from institutes that are going to be helping our group to look to the future. And so, with no further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to the next speaker.
The first theme for this afternoon session will be on the future of trade, investment, and development partnership, which will be presented by Dr. Mariama Williams. She is a senior research fellow with the South Center Geneva office, Geneva. So I'll not go further on that. I know that ACP, we know what South Center is. So to gain time, because we started already a bit late, 30 minutes 30 or more of delay, I hope this will not be the pace that ACP will take in the future. I thank you very much, Dr. Mariama. You have the floor.
Yes. I must say, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. The cultural entertainment has been fulfilling. The food has been fulfilling and satisfying. The conversation inspired, and just my head is brimming with ideas and things. I won't try to give them all to you here. So I will say all protocol observed. Excellencies, we're thankful, thank you, for the presentations this morning, especially the visit with the Honorable President of the General Assembly and all of the ambassadors from the BRICS countries who visited with us this morning, and all of you. Thank you for your time and energy in building this amazing institution. I bring you greetings and congratulations from the Executive Director of the South Center, Mr. Martin Kaur, who regrets that he cannot join us on account of pressing duties elsewhere. He's actually in Bonn at the climate negotiation, where I have the great news to tell you that from 90 pages of text in a week, we have now gone to 86 pages. So, and we still have a week of negotiation left, so we will see what will happen. He directs me to give his highest regards and hearty congratulations to you, Ambassador Gomes, on your assumption of the leadership of this august institution, the ACP, and says that he looks forward to even more greater achievements from the APC under your leadership, and that you can count on the South Center as a partner in your journey forward. My brief this afternoon is the theme of future trade and investment and development partnerships, a very big topic. Just a few preliminaries. I just wanted to say that I've been listening since yesterday, and anniversaries, as everyone has said, are time for introspection and reflection with friends and partners of past work achieved and looking forward to new and even greater achievement and strategic planning forward for the momentum into the rest of this century. What can ACP do to accelerate progress towards our core concerns of poverty eradication, gender equality and women's empowerment, and sustainable development? In one word, we're talking about economic transformation of the South, of ACP countries. 40 years is a long time for any institution. It is indeed inspiring and noteworthy to see the longevity of the ACP group and the respect with which the ACP group and its secretariat is held. Yesterday I heard many things about South-South cooperation, and I want to say, in my mind, at 40, ACP is, as an institution that oversees the interests of the South regions of Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific, to me is a premier template, an early template, if you will, of South-South cooperation. So ACP, in my mind, is one of the oldest South-South cooperation entity. It has also pioneered a north-south triangulation, given its relationship with Europe and the European, now from 6 to 12, now to 27 to 28 countries. So ACP has a long history of promoting the interests of the South with respect to trade and investment, and stimulating and maintaining partnership in this regard, fostering solidarity, cooperation, and joint action. I heard 4 phrases yesterday. I heard family, that ACP is a family. And it's true, ACP is a big family, 79, almost 80 members, I understand, and it's tricontinental. I heard solidarity, diversity, and relevance, that ACP must remain relevant in a changing time. So I want to move to my first part, which is setting the historic conjuncture and context in which the 21st century ACP will operate and must operate. It's a context that's dominated, as I said before, and has been said here today, increasing extreme events and their devastating impacts on the lives, livelihood, and infrastructure. As the President said, it's not just small islands or LDC. All of the coastal cities, Mombasa, all of the various cities of Africa and Asia are under threat from sea level rise and from flood water, from the receding glaciers that will cause water to inundate our courses. We also are in a changing competitive dynamics where the emerging economies have somewhat tempered the economic competitiveness of the North. And there's a response that they bring, and sometimes that response may not be always healthy or friendly to us, but we need to be careful around it. We have financial and economic crisis, health crisis, and epidemic with cross-border implications. There's rising inequality between and within countries and individuals in our economies. And these differences are quite visible given the modern time frame of communication, web, internet, cable, and they enhance and contribute to rising discontent and social disarticulation at home and abroad, especially among our young men and women. We also have the emerging threats of extremist group and discontent among, again, the youth and other marginalized groups who are vulnerable to recruitment by such groups. So that makes development profoundly important, because development is how we are going to be able to meet the aspirations of our people and channel their thinking and their thought, because they're very creative and they're very bright. They need places to channel this, or else they will be captured by other elements if there's a void. ACP will also operate in a new landscape in which, as we saw this morning, we have new formulation, IPSA, BRICS Bank, Chinese Infrastructural Bank, and we have growing development cooperation entities within the South, some of whose budgets far exceed those of the international organizations that we have traditionally relied on. BNDES, for example, the Brazilian Development Corporation. We've heard about India's development cooperation effort. We have the G20, G24, and all of these. We know also of LDCs, landlocked and mountainous region. We have a whole various permutation of these different formulation in different contexts. AOSIS in climate, we have the Commonwealth, we have the RECs, who have become increasingly more important in our work. We have intensification of trade and a plethora of regional and free trade agreements and investment agreements, many of which are very onerous provisions that will exert lock-in effect and constraints on development and industrialization. These include IPRs, governance, government procurement, rules in the trade area, domestic regulation, competition policy, investment liberalization, and environmental services. 2 more. We have what former President of Tanzania and chairperson of the board of South Center has identified as mega regionals. The tip Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and all of these are characterized by WTO plus issues, including regulatory issues which were traditionally part of domestic regulations. These mega regional implications, of which he has identified the EU EPA as one of these creatures, have implication for our development and should be of utmost concern to APC. Their very scope and the nature with which they set standards will reinforce or create new global standards and can unbundle much of what has been agreed multilaterally. So they have potentially adverse consequences for many of our countries. I won't go into the EPA because I'll have my paper and you can see some of the discussion there about the way that the EPA might impact development adversely. So I think my second point is that as the ACP moves into the 21st century, the focus is promoting economic transformation and sustainable development in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, and to promoting fair trade regionally and multilaterally. In the area of trade, the ACP will face increasingly pressure to forge greater linkage to broader development issue as it negotiates and as it develops international trade and investment agreement. Food security, health promotion, domestic policies, and government procurement, all of these must be a central part. These are all subject not to tariffs, but to non-tariff barriers. So we need to be very careful about a simplistic approach that predicts trade liberalization as tariff reduction. We need to focus on the NTBs, the TBTs, and all of the other things that are constraining and will constrain our growth. There's also increasingly contestations about the link between trade and investment and their development dimension in a world that is becoming increasingly competitive, in which developed countries are being more and more concerned about the competitive threat from the South, as well as their own prowess in managing global economics. This is a world where there's financial constraint and growing unemployment and economic insecurity, particularly in Europe, places that hitherto not experienced these type of events. So we find that finance and means of implementation may not be so forthcoming as we see in almost all multilateral negotiation. At the same time, the ACP of the post-2015 period will need to navigate the way forward in a world of the post-2015 development agenda, whatever that's agreed in September, inclusive of the SDG, which now numbers 17 goals and probably will likely stay that way, and over 169 targets that covers everything, most everything. Trade investment are a key aspect of this SDG, and so is climate change, goal 13. So let me just flag climate change a bit quickly. I want to flag the trade and development link with climate change. We know the science tells us, and the IPC 5th assessment report is quite clear, that we are living in a climate constrained world in which we must go to zero emissions by, some say 2013, others say 2015. But clearly we have to stop emitting fossil fuels if we are to maintain the 2 degrees. The 2 degrees has been agreed as the global guardrail, but 2 degrees is not safe for Africa. Africa is 1.5 more as a region. So 2 degrees means 3.5 to 4 for Africa, which means that Africa will face incredibly heat issue. Also Latin America is about 1 to 2.5. So 2 degrees safe for G7 countries, and even then we're not quite sure it's safe, relatively safe. But for the rest of us in SIDS and Africa and Asia, 2 degrees is not something we aim for. We think temperature should be kept at 1 to 1.5. So climate change have real implications for forests, soils, and ocean that we depend on. And the addressing climate change through adaptation and mitigation have implications for our capacity. So not only do we have to worry about the impacts of climate change, but how we address climate change also have implications for our capacity to ensure proper food and nutrition for citizens and to maintain our capacity to produce and to trade on the global market. Climate and change and trade linkage occur through very many pathways, of which I don't have time to go through. Agriculture being one, looking at mitigation. But the one I want to flag for us is that increasingly we see resort by many countries and people within those countries in tackling climate change to begin to propose carbon taxes on goods based on their travel, the emissions that they create in their production, and the emission to get them from host to home country, which makes many of our goods very vulnerable because we are very far from ports. And we already see that the EU and others have already put up aviation levies, and last month the EU Parliament has agreed to maritime levy. Now these all have, in climate change we call these unilateral trade measures, and the Climate Convention argues that they should not be used if they create adverse social and economic consequences for developing countries, and they come under the umbrella of response measure. And response measure is much broader because it speaks to how we should be supported not only to deal with these unilateral measures if they should occur. They should not occur. We should negotiate them as parties together. But if they should occur and people implement them on the grounds of mitigation, very well intentioned, but they will have adverse impact for us, we should be supported in diversifying our economies to be able to deal with these issues. So economic diversification is a big issue, and so trade is a very important, and I think increasingly we'll see more and more clashes within the WTO and other regional arrangement between trade and climate. Right now in the WTO, we have a tension. Some developing countries feel that we shouldn't talk anymore about climate and trade. It should occur in the WTO. The WTO say they're waiting for UNFCCC to talk about climate and trade. So we have the chicken and the egg situation. But eventually we'll have to deal with one in either forum. And I suspect it's going to be in the WTO forum, because already you see partners talking about environmental goods and services and various kinds of things as part of the new trade liberalization. And lastly, I don't know how much time I have, Madam, but I'll say that trade, 5 minutes. So the MC10, the WTO MC10, I think it's an area that is most immediate for ACP to tackle. We need to proactively work on ensuring the development dimension of trade, including the promotion of rural development and employment, especially as I tread for youth. We need to put great emphasis on early harvest of development issues in the Doha round. And as I said before, we need to really examine the use of TBT and tariff escalation and market access and how that impacts development. We need to strengthen SDTs and promote policy space for industrialization, agricultural development, because as we saw yesterday, our RECs are very busy and very actively, and rightly so, putting forward long-term plans for industrialization. Meantime, we might be precluding some of those in terms of if we don't get the policy space we need in the trade agreement or in climate. So we have to begin to interlink those agenda, and even if we're not negotiating them, we are aware of them as we do our planning. We need to work to offset the adverse development impacts of the push for new round by the developed country, where they're focusing on investment liberalization, competition policy, and government procurement policy, as well as new discipline in energy and environment. We need to have a strong support for LDC trade and development issues, and the LDCs are asking for a waiver on services, and they're asking for waiver for special differential treatment that will help them to build their capacity and to promote food production and employment. So many things we have to do. The one last area I want to flag is investment, because that was part of my brief. Now, investment is very wide, and one of the central problematic issues with investment is the bilateral investment agreement. And within the bilateral investment agreement is the provision called investor-state dispute settlement, wherein companies can sue governments if governments do their due diligence and promote health and environmental measures. Companies are suing governments under these investor-state dispute settlement. If you're aware of it, this is one of the big problems delaying the TPP, where many governments in Europe are now saying they will not sign the TPP if it has the investor-state procurement measure. Australia has been sued by Philip Morris for $100 billion. Ecuador has been sued for $100 billion. In the Pacific, I believe, if I'm not wrong, it was Marshall Islands also was sued. So many of our countries, some of you here may also be sued, but it's very quiet and very confidential. So governments, when they take measures for public health, for environmental measure, or for development measure, are being sued by companies, and there are law firms, developed countries law firms, who are going around encouraging companies to sue firm. And so it's become a big bonanza, a quick way to earn money. You don't have to put down production facility anymore. You simply sue a developing country and you negotiate, and under these secretive tribunal, you get a judgment against you. There's no super court to go to, and so governments are stuck with this. So there's a big push by many governments to re-examine the bilateral agreement. Indonesia has re-examined it and it's trying to exit from the ones that it has. South Africa also has re-examined and is not going to sign any more bits that have these investor-state dispute, and many countries in Latin America. So please be aware of it. And as ACP, when we're discussing investment agreement, we need to begin to let our state parties know that they need to not sign automatically investor-state agreements in these provisions, whether trade agreement or investment agreement, that makes them vulnerable to lawsuits from companies. Now, some of these bilateral agreements have escape clause. So even if you terminate the agreement, the investor-state clause lives for 20 years. So that means you need to negotiate with the partners. And so there's UNCTAD and others, including the South Center, are leading the struggle to try to get the partners to negotiate and get rid of these survival clause. And so we're advising developing countries to review your bits. And if you have bits that are expiring and are coming up to be renewed, then do not sign them again with the investment, because they automatically renew if you don't do anything. So many countries are now reviewing those, and many of the RECs, COMESA has been very involved in some of these, and I think it's something that we need to pay attention to, because it's squandering very scarce public resources that we have, that we should be spending on education, health, and so forth, and production, and giving it to corporations and lawyers from the developed countries. So that's it. So let me wrap up quickly. I'm jumping. Okay, so I think the APC for the 21st century has to be proactive around promoting local industries and value addition. We talked about that within our region. But we must also be aware that these big mega regionals like the TPP and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, though they're amongst the big country, they have implication for us. They have implication for how we climb up the value chain. They have implication for us in terms of the standards that they set, which will come back into the multilateral process, and they have implication because they're overriding the agreements that we have forged over the last 20 years in the WTO. They have these potential, as many commentators have pointed out. So we really need to be very careful and start examining these TPP for how they'll impact. There's been good work looking at how they will impact sub-Saharan Africa, but not much elsewhere. I think outside of Geneva, we need to reorient the ACP group. We need to reorient ACP and reposition itself with regard to Europe, and that's been said here since yesterday and today. While maintaining the essential and deep connection with Europe, we need to also broaden and deepen our relationship with emerging economies and different markets. This is a reality that is occurring on the ground in many cases, but it's not always the case that our political organs are following up. So ACP will require awareness, intentionality, and deep restructuring of how it functions, and importantly, its financing, if it's able to agilely and flexibly do these kind of things. Undoubtedly, the ACP reform process and the strategic analysis by the group of eminent persons now in place will give more distinct and specific solution and pointers on the way ahead. It is my belief that outside of Geneva and capitals, the economic brainpower of the South on development cooperation and other issues is in the ACP, and that the ACP needs to recognize that and to regird itself to meet that challenge as we go forward. And so on behalf of the South Center, I say onward to a successful achievement of the imperatives of poverty eradication and sustainable development with peace and security for us all. Long live the APC for the 21st century. And thank you, Ambassador Gomes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Williams for this excellent presentation. Now I'll pass on the floor to Dr. Siphamandla ZONDI. He is the executive director of the Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa. It's a think tank on the dialogue on Africa and the world, the North and South, and is a teacher also at the Thabo Mbeki Institute Leadership in South Africa. So you have the floor on the dynamics and challenges of the global governance process for change. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thanks very much and congratulations to Your Excellency, Dr. Patrick GOMES, on your new and very exciting responsibility, which is to assist an organization that has reached its 40th anniversary. We often say life begins at 40. So the life of this institution is beginning, and you are at the helm of it at that time. So thank you, and much appreciated. Your Excellencies and distinguished guests, I want to greet you. I have a simple task, which is to reflect broadly on the implications of the future of the ACP for global governance and the implications of global governance for the future of the ACP. I would like to preface it by saying this small little point. I would just like to make just 6 points so that we have discussions to go on. I can circulate the paper for people to read on. The first point I want to make is that we're dealing with new challenges that are old challenges. The new challenges we face are old challenges. And we're dealing with a new world, which is an old world. And that idea came back to my mind when our friend from the EU said, we're not just partners, but we're friends. And then thereafter he left the building. Abandoned the friends.
Terrible.
Yes. So we're dealing with, we have a new partnership, but we have an old partnership. We have a new relationship, but we're the old people. We have a new discourse, but we have an old reality. We have a new sense of where we want to go, but we are struggling to break with the old. That brings to mind the Italian Marxist point that the old is dying, but the new is struggling to be born, and in the interregnum, there are morbid symptoms that suggest you are moving, but there are others that suggest you are not moving. But there is movement, but there is no motion. There is some shaking, but there is no movement. There seems to be some activity, but there is no progress. There's a lot of discussion, but there is no outcome. And there's an African saying which says, they who fail to till the land say the fields have been bewitched. It seems the field has been bewitched, isn't it? And he who cannot dance say the grass has thorns. Such morbid symptoms. So we have to place everything in the context of the myth of the new. And it's an illusion of the new. And all societies have to create myths. A myth is not something necessarily bad, but all societies have to create myths in order to drive changes that they want to do. We have to create an utopia. We have to create what we now, in a nice way, to call a vision. It's an illusion of a future in the present. Now, in this particular case, one part of the illusion is a post-colonial world, which suggests that the post means that there is a break between the old and there's a birth of the new at independence. But as you and I know, there was a break of certain things at independence, but a non-breaking of other things at independence. Which is why we have to work at this, which is why ACP had to be born. It had to be born because the new was not getting born and the old was not dying. That's how I see it. It doesn't matter what those who sat at that time thought about it, but looking at it in hindsight, you can realize that it was born not because we made choices about its birth, but because we could not make choices about its birth, it had to be born. I like to quote here Julius Nyerere, former president of Tanzania, who writes in his memoirs that he told the people of Tanzania years after independence, a few years after independence, that Tanzania stood at a confluence of challenges and possibilities. So then he said they had a tough choice to make. And he said that choice was that they had to change quickly or they would be absorbed in the change made by others. That is what he told them. Then he writes, I quote, "I was wrong." I thought he was right. I'm sure we all think so. Let's see what he says, how he explains. He says, there was no choice. They had to change and will still be changed. It was not a choice between change and being changed. It was a necessity to change. It was a necessity because the conditions required that you should change. Now, I use this to describe the ACP as not just an appendage of its relationship with the EU. Whatever the reality has seemed to be all along, but the ACP has always been beyond that. It has always been beyond just its relationship with the EU, because the foundations of the ACP were not a choice made because of an opportunity with the EU. It was a choice that needed to be made because of the time. And it is born in 1975, just 2 years after the beginning of an oil crisis and an energy crisis that decimated the economies, changed the rules of the game globally in terms of global governance. And the poorer countries where they got the sharpest end of the knife. They had the worst implications of what happened in the 1970s. And they will have to live through the consequences of that. So when it happens, this birth of ACP, it was the right time. It wasn't necessarily a product of the Lome Agreement. But it was, I would suggest, a product of the Georgetown Agreement. And the two agreements happen in the same year, but they are different. I want to suggest that they are different in this way. If you look at the Georgetown Agreement, it has 4 objectives. All of these objectives suggest that the people forming the ACP were aware of the significance of their identity as countries on the margins of the world. And realizing that they could not change the things they needed to change through the help of somebody else, but they needed to organize themselves in order to respond to this. So put in another way, they realized that they were giving expression to a geopolitical idea whose time had come. It is very clear from those 4 objectives that they realized that the time has come for interdependence. But there is no interdependence without independence, because interdependence assumes the connection of independent institutions in order to work for a common good. There is no common good if you have no good and others have a good. You can commonalize a good of somebody else, but you need common good, which means you arrive at it because you realize that it is it. So interdependence does not become on the basis of paternalistic relations of inequality, but on the basis of recognition and acceptance that others are independent and they have interest and they have views too. The first objective of the Georgetown Agreement that gave expression to this, what I'm saying, refers to this idea of mutual support, of solidarity, which is a necessity for those who are on the margins of society, who are becoming victims of global prosperity. The people on the margins have no choice but to click together. like immigrants and refugees everywhere else, they are such a community because their conditions necessitate that they should cling together. And the second objective about cooperation, it finds meaning in the efforts of the group to promote economic and trade relations among its member states and its constituent regions, realizing that the future was not merely in improving the relationship with the EU, but it was actually harnessing the potential that lies among the members of the ACP. The third objective relates to the idea of, and I quote what they call it, the new international economic order. It's a radical idea. It's a dangerous idea. It was a dangerous idea in a world where there should be only one economic order. To ask for a new is to ask for the destruction of the current. To ask for a new is to act against the interest of the partner whose primary interest is to maintain power and privilege. Whether they realize it or not, it doesn't matter. That statement is revolutionary and radical by nature. And therefore it is dangerous right from the word go. Now, I want to, because I know we don't have much time, I want to then say, on this basis, the third point I want to make, the very evolution of the ACP suggests that it has been responding all the time to changes in global governance. If you don't believe me, besides what I said about the 1970s, if you look at the renewal of Lome in 1980, it coincided with a period of critical discussions within the South about cooperation and integration that would give rise to proliferation of regional economic schemes right through the South, and more so in Africa with the establishment of ECOWAS, then ECAS, then EAC, and the Southern African Development Cooperation Conference, and others. So it coincided at the time when the South was thinking about a new deal. What is our new deal for strengthening our internal dynamics? And that is why the texture of the conversations leading to the renewal of Lome in 1980 reflects that great interest in support for regional integration. Again, if we look at the critical consummation of Lome 4 in 1990, after very difficult negotiations, it happens again at a time when the Global South is increasingly concerned about the raw deals it is receiving in its discussions globally. You remember that there have been big discussions around the external trade debt, big discussions around the proliferation of small arms, and the countries of the South had received a raw deal in that. And they were feeling that they were also receiving a raw deal from this preeminence of the ideological conflict within the West, which is the conflict called between the capitalists and the communists, which are both Western ideological positions, have very little to do with us, that were giving us a raw deal in the process because we're being asked to choose one or the other. And you will notice that it is in that context that you see significant changes beginning to happen in the rest of the South with regards to the attitude towards multilateral governance system. So there is a sense that they're responding to matters of global governance. Again, if we look at what then happens, is that period is followed by the move towards the end of the Cold War and the birth of what George Bush Sr. called the birth of a new world order. It was another promise that it would changing the global governance system, and that generated a lot of hope. It was a period that coincided with a wave of democratization affecting mainly Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa. It was a period of hope. But a period of hope that quickly, like the period of independence, led to shattered dreams and illusions and constipation of change. Because what happened is that rather than leading to a multipolar world, it led to a unipolar world. What the Americans called unimultipolar, which is an oxymoron. You can't be both uni and multi. But meaning that it's a multipolar system that will have one major state, because there had been what they call the end of history. There can only be a end of history for those who have history. But for those whose history is denied, for those whose history is denigrated, for those whose history is cast asunder, there is no end of history, because the history has not begun. So that is why the 1990s and the 2000s see a lot of hope in the global south, that you could generate a new responses to global situations. And I'm sure many of you, Your Excellency, will remember the South Commission that was chaired by Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, which really tried in very pragmatic ways to give expression to the dream of Bandung of 1955, which was a very humane dream, which is we want to push development on the basis of our experience, what is called endogenous development. Not import development models from elsewhere, but develop on the basis of our experience. Secondly, that we want to grow by depending on each other a lot more, what was called self-reliance, collective self-reliance. And thirdly, we want to cooperate with the global north on the basis of equal terms. That was a simple human ask that was always seen as a problem. Now, I am actually saying then, therefore, the 2000s, in the 2000s, we see attempts again to grapple with the change in global governance, but the old is struggling to die. Because the discussions start about the UN reform. They begin about the reform of the international finance institutions in order to reflect the global realities of today, but none of those discussions move. They can't move not because there is a witch somewhere or a demon or a devil somewhere, but because there are states whose interests are to maintain the status quo. It is in the direct interest not to change, not to transform global governance, to make it truly global rather than regional globalized as it is right now. The idea of globalization is such an interesting idea because globalization is a continuous term, a word that expresses an action. To globalize is to move something that is not global to make it global. Is to take something that is regional, in this particular case, Western European and North American, and make it global. To globalize, which means it's not global. In order to globalize other ways of being, other ways of knowledge, other ways of doing economy must die by nature. So the Pacific islands have to, the price they have to pay in order to join globalization, they have to give up on their centuries-old ideas about how to survive in treacherous seas. Because globalization requires that you should die so that the regional can become global. So the idea of globalization again undermines global governance. Let me wrap up then. Let me wrap up by saying, but at the same time, the ACP has been among a few critical organizations in preserving the dream of a truly new world. It has taken common positions, common negotiating position on a number of issues, from question of international economic order to a question of international development as a right, not as an economic activity or something, but as a right. Thirdly, the question of reform of global governance. Fourth, the question of reform of global economy. Fifth, the question of reform of global political governance generally, with the reform of the UN as central. Fifth, the common position on environment. and dealing with the green issues, and sixth, the question of international security and focusing mainly on the idea that war should not be an option, and therefore you're fighting for a nuclear-free world, where security means peace in essence. My fifth point, which is just one before last, is that if you look at where global governance is right now, is this picture I have painted of a constipated idea of a new global governance, which would make it unnecessary to have an ACP. ACP exists because something is wrong with global governance. It is constipated. In order to create BITRAs, you have to create diplomatic clubs, you have to create alliances, you have to create multilateral institutions from the South. It's not necessary, but it is made necessary by the constipation of the system. Now, in this period, we have seen an accelerated, first one, the revival of the big multilateral organizations of the South, beginning with the process to revive the non-aligned movement in the 1990s, to the re-energization of the G77. But at the same time, we have seen an amazing emergence of small clubs, what we call diplomatic clubs, from among the countries of the South as a result of the emergence of major economies from the global South that are altering the global balance of power in the economic side. Here I am talking about the IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa. I'm talking about the BRICS. I am talking about the KVETs. I'm talking about the MINT. I'm talking about many other smaller clubs whose primary purpose really, if you look at them very carefully, is to harness their esteemed position in the international system as emerging powers, is to harness the positions of the rest that the rest have been taking in the NAM, in the G77, in the General Assembly. But they have not been able to get them done because they are denigrated, they are marginalized, they are ignored. So these new emerging powers are trying to push for the same agenda revolving around those three issues I mentioned emerged out of 1955 Bandung. So what then is happening is that this is creating opportunities for placing the agendas of the bigger organizations in the hands of custodians like IPSA, like BRICS, like KVETs, because there is a greater chance for them to be listened to than the rest of the crowd. And therefore, this places on an ACP, there is the necessity to think about how we as the ACP create organic relationship with these IPSA, BRICS, and other organs so that we leverage on their better positioning and better influence in the international system. Just to illustrate, the Chinese established the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Even Western powers that see China as a problem line up to join it against the advice of the United States, which simply means if they too see it as important, we should see it as very important. Why? Because it enables us to access the capital we need in order to boost infrastructure in terms of ports, in terms of energy, in terms of transportation and telecommunications. That will enable us to trade at terms more favorable than before. Therefore, the emergence of these new economic powers offer opportunities for us to access new financial investments in order to access development finance at rates that are more favorable than it had been the case with the World Bank, with the IMF, and the rest of them. Secondly, they offer us opportunities to access markets for trade and investment from our countries that may actually not exist in other places. And thirdly and lastly, they offer us opportunity to enhance our voice globally so that what we've been saying, which we think is just common sense, has a chance of being heard elsewhere. But lastly, we must be mindful of the fact that the global reforms that are taking place or global changes that are taking place could also harm organizations like ACP by marginalizing it to the advantage of the smaller groups like IPSA and the BRICS and others. This is the same challenge faced by the non-aligned movement, by the G77, that as we saw in the climate change negotiations in Copenhagen, that the basic group of emerging powers, its word carried more weight than the more democratic group of the G77 countries. So there's always a danger that the South may become divided as a few become elevated as special ones that are closer to us in the center, those who are in the center. And there are opportunities around the idea of UN reform, but there are also dangers. There are opportunities around the rise of regional development banks, but there are also dangers. There are opportunities around polarization in the multilateral trade negotiations within the WTO and in climate change negotiations, but there are also dangers, as they were illustrated by the discussion yesterday, that we could make commitments that are huge and they look morally good, but they tax your ability to actually drive industrial development, because we are burdened with now shifting to renewable energy, but we cannot drive low-level industrialization on the basis of renewable energy, and so on. And very, very lastly, therefore, I want to suggest that there are at least four things that the ACP needs to think about. One is that we need to strengthen the organization institutionally. It has to have very strong political and administrative structures if it is going to respond to the current challenges of global governance. Secondly, it must be stronger in the sense of being independent. It has to think very carefully about its own vision and strategy, its own idea and ideology, and its own resources. I know I mentioned ideology and then everybody must be shaking head. You don't need ideology. There isn't anything that does not have an ideology. Even to say we don't need ideology is ideological itself. Because all ideologies are about an idea of an end from the beginning. If you have no idea of an end from the beginning, don't even begin. Because you are saying, I will get wherever I can get to. So it needs to fashion its ideology. And from Bandung, we have had the same ideology all along, and it seems to be the basis on which you need to build. Collective self-reliance, endogenous development, solidarity, and international cooperation. My view, that is the ideology we should preserve. Thirdly, we need to refine our substantive agenda by harnessing the successes we've seen out of the ACP. One of the greatest successes has been ACP's ability to provide a platform for coherent positions in the negotiations in the WTO. That same success can be used in the negotiations on international finance for development, on international development effectiveness, and so on, and so on. And I think that substantive agenda should include trade and investment, with a very strong emphasis on intra-regional trade and inter-regional trade within the ACP. It must include human development, responses to questions of poverty, and so on. It has to include the question of environment and climate change, given what the small islands and developing states face. And one but last of the proposals is that the ACP should consider establishing an ACP fund, however small it is. And this is the fund that those who call ACP friend should deposit into if they really mean friend. Because you give a friend money to put into their wallet, you don't keep money in your wallet to help a friend. Because at the point when a friend has to come to you every time to withdraw, you are no longer a friend. You are a misfriend, a disfriend. So that the ACP can also harness its relationship with emerging powers, your China, your India and others, to contribute there for concrete projects, especially dealing with the small and island states, the LCDs, and other vulnerable members of the ACP. And very lastly, the ACP has to develop a strategy for building strategic alliances and cooperation with the future of the world, which is the emerging powers. All studies show that the future of the world, the top 11 countries in the world in terms of economic size, in the next 20 years, would come from the South almost entirely. And therefore, there is no point neglecting those who will become significant in the future. Because we have to think about the next 20 years, those who will have the biggest sources of money, who will have the biggest influence on global decision making, who will have the biggest potential to cause the change we're looking for, have got to be important while we harness the relationship we have with the global South. I think I've overexploited your kindness as a neighbor of ours in Southern Africa. And very, very lastly, I wanted to say, therefore, the ACP has an existence beyond its relationship with the EU, not because of the end of the Cotonou Agreement, but because the Georgetown idea was anyway a independent ACP relating with an independent EU, and therefore now relating with the rest of the world in transforming global governance and harnessing opportunities globally. Thanks.
Muitíssimo obrigado, meu vizinho.
Thank you very much indeed to my neighbour, who has taken advantage of the fact of being a neighbour to exceed his speaking time somewhat. But I thought it was interesting to his ideas because he brought us from the past to the future to look to the future. So thank you once again for that presentation.
Last but not least, call upon Professor Dr. Djeneba TRAORE, the Director General of West Africa Institute, which is sited in Cabo Verde, on the impact of globalization and the prospects of small states. You have the floor, Madam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency. Monsieur le Ministre, je vais parler en français.
I'll speak French. Minister, Secretary General of the ACP Group, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. First of all, I'd like to present the West Africa Institute's compliments to the ACP and its Secretary General for everything that's been done in terms of actions and results to move forward the cause of African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. And having said that, I'm at a disadvantage. I'm last, so virtually everything's already been said. And I wonder what I can contribute that's new for the august public we have here. So if you'll allow me, I want to share with you a few reflections that I've summarized on the impact of globalization and perspectives for the future for small states. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate Mr. GOMES for having organized this session. What's remarkable in what the ACP do is that when the group was set up in 1975, the countries were already expressing a wish to promote trade and economic links at interregional and regional level. In 1992, when the agreement was amended, the human dimension was taken into account. And that shows that solidarity is a vital condition for achieving development. The 7th Summit of Heads and State of Government of the ACP, which was held on the 13th and 14th of December 2012 in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea, brought out the declaration of Sipopo on the future of the group, underlined the fact that ACP countries were at a crossroads and would need to take important decisions for the future of the group. So when Mr. GOMES suggested I give this presentation, I was very honoured, of course, but since I'm Mali, and let me just salute Mr. Cissé from my country and the ambassador from Cabo Verde, Mr. Borges, who was Minister for Foreign Relations when our institute was set up. Well, I was wondering then whether I was the right person to deal with this topic, because I'm from a continental country, Mali, which has a border with 7 countries. Nevertheless, I said that perhaps the fact that I'm at the IAO, which is a research institute dealing with integration in West Africa, wants to carry out innovative studies, organize skill building sessions for people involved in integration in West Africa, and create scientific and social dialogue. And I thought it must be because of that that I'd been invited. So I looked at what would be the best way to deal with this subject, which is new for me myself, in fact, because small states, you won't find a definition in the dictionary of what a small state is. But I looked at for doctoral theses on that, and there aren't any either. So in 2002, there was a study carried out by the FAO on the impact of internationalization on agriculture in small states, and it's on the basis of that document that I put together this presentation. I also researched how many small states there were, around 35 recognized by the UN, about 10 which haven't been recognized, 17 that are very small, under 320,000 square kilometers.
Cela dit, je passerai.
So the IAO then was set up in 2010, the 28th of June 2010, and it was the government of Cabo Verde, the UNESCO, UMOA and CEDEAO and the ECOWAS were behind the setting up of this organization. The aim, we had seen that integration in the area was speeding up, and we wanted to have a think tank which would help regional organizations to formulate suitable policy to finish regional integration in the region, or to complete it. Let me now look at the impact of globalization on small states. A quick definition of the idea of mondialisation or internationalization. I found a definition which refers to mondialisation as a process whereby relations between nations have become interdependent and gone beyond the physical and geographical limits that existed previously. Mondialisation or internationalization has several aspects. It deals with politics, economy, culture, society, information. It represents the opening of borders and the arrival of international trade, outsourcing, and free circulation of people and goods. According to that's a quote. According to its supporters, mondialisation is a necessary process in the move towards industrialization and the development of developing countries, thanks to trade. So it seems that internationalization would be incompatible with the idea of nation states. There's a specialist in this area called Nayan Chanda, who thinks the process began around 40,000 to 60,000 years before Jesus Christ. It started with the emigration of people from Central Africa to Asia. And there was then a series of exchanges of goods and exchanges in terms of population as people dispersed. The colonial system then increased the flow of raw materials between the colonies and colonial powers, with industrialization becoming involved. It's certainly a very old process, but in 1916 was when the word first appeared, and it was the Belgian Paul-Marie Ghislaine Hotelin who came up with this word. He lived from 1868 to 1944, was considered as the father of information science. So the concept came out of thinking about the reorganization of international life after the First World War, and referred to a transfer to the world level. And this term, internationalization, mondialisation, evolved through 1964, through the Cold War, and so on. And then we got the inclusion of the word globalisation. Interest in internationalisation increased during the 1980s, 1990s, and now we've got this idea of a planet-wide village. And there were academic debates, and there have been anti-internationalisation and alternative internationalisation movements which focused on the negative social consequences of the phenomenon. Those who oppose the idea of internationalization complain of the following: exaggerated liberalization, deregulation of national economies, the hegemony of international companies, multinationals, the emergence of a kind of cultural standardization, homogenization of human relations and the disappearance of individual characteristics, and then finally the effect on the environment and climate warming. To go back to the effect on small states, as I said, there haven't been any studies carried out on the issue. That's academic studies. We did find an FAO study which deals with small developing countries, their characteristics and vulnerabilities, and which provides a number of specificities, characteristics which are inherent to small states. They've identified 3. The first is a small population, which means there's no possibility of economies of scale or specialization of labor. Secondly, a small resource base, which creates dependence on consumer goods imports and capital goods imports, and which exposes the economy to natural dangers and catastrophes. And then high level of concentration of exports with a small number of primary products, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, which make these small countries vulnerable to fluctuations in production and prices. Small states are dependent for their income on foreign currency from primary products, and they have very little of their own capital available for productive investment. In the same study, we're talking about countries that are very small, very open countries, open to trade, and their common denominator of all these countries is how small the domestic market is, limited natural resources, competitiveness and economies of scale, the issues there, and vulnerability to changes on the international markets, and vulnerability to environmental changes. These bring additional costs and turn resources away from other areas that they could be used for. So, to conclude, economic vulnerability and environmental vulnerability of small states are key challenges of internationalization. So what does the future hold? What are the perspectives? In the economic and financial crisis that marks international trade at the moment, that's a major challenge for small states. If the aim of internationalization is to allow all countries to trade, we should also take into account that it benefits some countries more than others. The specific characteristics of small states, a small market, the low price for natural resources, non-industrialization, poor transport links, lack of competitiveness, lack of raw materials, fragility and vulnerability to natural catastrophes and so on. These are real handicaps in facing up to internationalization. So how does one do that when one is a small state? What can small states do looking to the future? The example of Cape Verde, can give us some ideas. It is a small country, in inverted commas. It has all the characteristics we mentioned earlier, but it has taken a great leap forward in its social and economic development over the last 20 years. And it's facing up to the challenges of internationalization very well indeed. Given all the constraints, and even in the face of the crisis of 2007. There's a report by the African Development Bank called Cape Verde, a Model of Success, that was published in 2012. And it shows us why this is the case. So the country has 530,000 inhabitants, density of 124 people per kilometre squared, a rural population 37.42%, an urban population 62.58%. 30.92% of the population is below 15 years old. It's been a country of emigration that over the years has become a country where Western African countries, migrants come. Politically speaking, again, according to this report, Cape Verde has had a good democratic transition. It's a model of good governance and transparency in its financial and accounting management. The government is now very credible on its macroeconomic policies through putting in place a transparent financial system which has no corruption. It has won the confidence of investors and has managed to put in place solid partnerships. Cape Verde's economy is based on fisheries, agriculture, and mainly tourism. And thanks to the good results that have been achieved, economic results, the state is now a medium income country. Quoting from the report now, in spite of its difficulties, Cape Verde is the 5th of the sub-Saharan countries in terms of the Human Development Index. Its progress towards meeting the Millennium Development Goals is better than many other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. There is universal access to primary and secondary education, and there is a good social security net. And the advantages of growth have been fairly shared out through an inclusive approach to policy drafting and nation building. There is a lack of medical personnel, particularly specialist doctors, but the health system is nevertheless effective and supports the poorer social sectors of the country. Development of agriculture and the rural sector is one of the government's priorities. There have been major droughts which have been dealt with through a strategy based on the use of technologies which are suitable for arid and semi-arid soil. There is low rainfall and insufficient agricultural yield, and the system was adapted to this. The educational system is offers the best performance in the West African region, and it's the only one that has achieved the aims of education for all. The country's most important strength is its human resources, high-level human resources, and investing in training and skill and capacity building and social cohesion has been another way of ensuring sustainable development. We've met 3 major challenges. We've got industrial growth by focusing on innovation. We've promoted the energy industry and made efforts in the area of renewable energy and energy efficiency. We've improved health infrastructure and got better specialization of doctors, and then we've developed our transport sector and developed agriculture. The government from 2011 onwards, under the Prime Minister, José Maria Neves, launched a process to provide a vision for Cape Verde as an emerging country by 2030. They organized a national forum on economic transformation in the long term, with significant participation by diaspora, which is very important to development. The clear ambition was to make Cape Verde's economy modern, developed, diverse, and to stop it being dependent on external aid. To make this a reality, key actors were identified and a call was launched to economic agents, Cape Verdean economic agents, to invest in their country and support growth. As a conclusion, we would have the following recommendations. Meeting the challenges of internationalization for a small state requires enlightened, effective leadership based on a strategic vision in the medium and long term, with a strategic plan at national, regional and international level. Secondly, the state must ensure it trains quality human resources which will be able to implement sustainable development strategies. The principle of solidarity must be observed so that small states can benefit of least developed country status, so that measures will help them to deal with the constraints of internationalization. And because strength comes from union, small states must establish tight cooperation links. Best use must be made of information and communication technology. The capacities and skills of the various stakeholders concerned must be strengthened as regards the concept and process of internationalization and on the geopolitical culture of northern countries. And finally, improving negotiating skills with partner states on the one hand, particularly where the EPAs are concerned, and with multinational companies regarding contracts for exploiting natural resources to get win-win situations. Finally, citizens must be made responsible and must have buy-in in order to achieve the objectives that the governments are setting themselves. Because development aid is becoming less and less popular and more difficult to get. As a result, responsibility for achieving sustainable development and meeting the challenges of internationalization is a duty of states and citizens. I wanted to make a final remark on the role of culture and history for meeting development challenges. I've always thought myself that Africa suffers from a loss of collective memory of its history, and its diaspora isn't included in its agenda. So we need to recall the history of the continent. We need to research the history of the continent. We shouldn't we shouldn't forget about the role of research for policy making. We need to include researchers so that they can become change agents and can contribute to the growth of the countries they come from. And finally, I don't want to take up too much time, Madam Chairman. I'd like to thank you for your kind attention, and I wish the ACP group a happy anniversary and success in achieving the goals of its wonderful development. And I'd also like to give Mr. GOMES a small gift to express our appreciation of your work. It's a Cape Verdean dancer, a batuk dancer, a traditional Cape Verdean dance. And it's lovely, I think.
Merci, merci.
Et j'ai encore un petit pour votre bureau personnel. Voilà, voilà. Ce sont les îles du Cap Vert.
These are the islands of Cape Verde. Some of them are very small, but you would be very welcome there, and they're all very lovely islands.
Merci, merci.
Thank you very much for that brilliant presentation, as well as for the gifts. Thank you very much. And now we're going to move on to the debate. So I'll open the floor if anyone wants to take the floor on the three presentations.
Thank you. Antes, talvez desculpe.
I do apologize. Perhaps I could ask for your attention. I just wanted to say that amongst us we have the minister from Haiti. Thank you for allocating so much importance to our group. And I know you've been here since yesterday, so thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you very much. So, starting again then. Well, we have Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde.
Guiné-Bissau pediu a palavra.
Guinea-Bissau asked for the floor, and then
Depois, logo a seguir, seguirá o
the Senegalese journalist. But the Guinea-Bissau ambassador has the floor.
L'ambassadeur.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. And I would also like to express my thanks to, obviously, the three eminent figures
Je dirais pour chacun d'entre eux.
who have each given brilliant presentations, magisterial presentations, and who have shared with us their visions for the future and possible perspectives for the ACP, based on their experiences, obviously. If I may, I won't necessarily tackle the points in order of who spoke first. I would like to comment on Dr. ZONDI's comments, Director of the Institute for Global Dialogue. I listened with a great deal of interest to what he said. And the enthusiasm of the new generation was quite evident. A generation that has been moved by recent changes in their country, and indeed in my country too, are determined to see change introduced. He was very careful to give us some lessons on physics, reminding us that moving doesn't necessarily mean progressing, and that therefore we should always ask whether the decisions that are taken are the right ones, and the modus operandi adopted and proposed for applying some rules, and in particular when it comes to introducing some decisions that are sometimes taken at the highest possible levels. Now, I may not totally agree with his pessimism, because it is true, when I was his age, I too asked about the foundation underpinning certain theories. And so when you say, Mr. ZONDI, that the new order, the new international order, the new economic international order is, and I'm simplifying, so you'll have to apologize if I've misunderstood you, is just an invention of the mind. I'm not sure if I totally agree with you, because I was fortunate enough to see the beginning of this concept in 1974 in the United Nations, and that was under the presidency of an eminent African who was president of the Algerian Republic, who then was the foreign minister, one of the most brilliant, whose intellectual skills, and in particular his persuasive forces as well, was the president of the National Assembly of the UN. And I do remember, because that's when Guinea-Bissau actually became member of the UN, so that's something you don't forget. And that's actually when the concept was developed, and it was developed by us. It was we who wanted it. It was we who developed this concept. It was we who fought to ensure that we actually would have a new world economic order, because we were unhappy with the prevailing order. And so we said, well, the older ones, I was a junior, I just listened. And I was very interested in what was being done and what was being said around me. So this very concept is something that we invented because we felt, and when I say we, I mean we as a whole, we felt that it was time it was right and appropriate for that to be the case, because we didn't agree, we weren't satisfied with the prevailing order. And we felt, therefore, that we needed to move things. We needed movement. So I don't totally share your reading of this concept. And then, contrary to you, and I'm not trying to contradict you, but I think that we are here, are we not, to debate ideas. So I do feel that perhaps we need to be slightly more optimistic, in particular when you're your age. Because if you aren't optimistic to a certain extent, it's difficult to overcome obstacles. But then I think you're right too, to question the inertia, this intellectual laziness that sometimes invades us. Maybe we've become too comfortable with some theories, which in practice haven't led to the results that we'd expected. But what I would like is for Africa, the new Africa that you, the younger generation, represent, that you should be more optimistic. You're quite combative, but questioning everything on a systematic basis that comes from the old order won't necessarily lead to the results that you're wanting. Sometimes, and I wouldn't say always, sometimes you have to ask just why things haven't achieved the results that were expected using the systems that have been developed, and see how in this globalized world, contrary to what you said, we are in a globalized world. Let's remember, ladies and gentlemen, that when you were at school, what was the globe made up of? Well, the globe was that thing that you had in the corner in the schoolroom. It was a geometrical area of the Earth. That was the globe. And if you went to go and buy books before school and people said you had to buy a globe, you'd buy a small globe, and that was what it was, the Earth. And that's where the idea of globalization came from, even if Mrs. TRAORE was wanting us to bear in mind the fact that the use of the term goes back to before that. But the word globe, I'm going to go and get a globe. The globe, it was the geometrical area representing the Earth, showing how the planet is put together. So globalization, whether you want it or not, whether you admit it or not, exists, and it's a dynamic process which you are better being a part of than having it imposed upon you. And so rather than sitting in the back seat, let's be in the driver's seat and let's be in charge of our own destiny. And then I would agree with globalization if that's the approach we adopt towards it. But as I was saying, when I was your age, I had the similar ideas to you. Since then, reality sometimes teaches you to be more optimistic and more realistic at the same time. But now I'd like to come back, if I may, and I apologize if I seem to have concentrated more on Mr. ZONDI's presentation than on others, but I just wanted to say that when we're talking about trade and investment, you have to, first of all, ensure that you have a favorable environment. I don't want to go into too many details on this subject because the constituent elements of a global approach are items that have been fairly well developed here. But what I would like to do is talk about a favorable environment for investments, and to say that as we heard this morning from the Minister of Haiti, making it clear that if you don't have a robust legal system which can guarantee investments, if you do not have a legal system, a judicial system that will act as a guarantor for the way in which your courts function, for the way in which investments work, and can ensure that investment, whether it be national investment or the investment of people from outside who decide to invest, that they can be sure that their money isn't going to end in the pockets of people who are corrupt, well, it's absolutely vital that you do have good concepts of good governance, which are quite clear. And here I would agree with what was said about Cabo Verde, because justice and corruption cannot coexist. Where you have corruption, you cannot have objective justice. Justice has to be accessible to all. Justice has to be acceptable to all, accessible to all, and it has to provide fair-handed justice. You may not be satisfied with a result, but at the very least, you have to have a guarantee that the ruling that was handed down was fully respectful of the law. So justice is the keystone underpinning democracy, good governance, and the way in which states work properly. We often forget this. If you have a system where the legal system doesn't work, if you have a country where this keystone of democracy does not exist, then nothing will work, because you will have corruption. You will have people buying judges and the ruling. People will go and see the judge, hand over an envelope, and the ruling will have been handed down even before the court meets and before the judge even hears what the situation is. So that's what's vital. You have to combat corruption. That's how you guarantee that you are going to have impartial justice, independent and autonomous justice, as the Minister of Haiti indicated. You need to have separation of powers of the executive and the judiciary. Unless you have that independence, you won't have impunity, because the cancer and the gangrene that's eating away at African society is impunity. You know where I come from. I know what I'm talking about. So we should be combating impunity. Justice must be accessible to all, to citizens. Citizens must have confidence in their legal system. They must know that if they go to the courts, then they can trust the judges, that they can trust in the lawyers and the magistrates, and that the ruling that is handed down will not only respect the law, but will also be fair and will ensure that there are equal rights for all citizens before the law, no matter what their social status may be, no matter what their social status is. So that's what I wanted to say on that point. And then I'd like to conclude, obviously, by thanking once again Mrs. Traoré for having given us that captivating example of Cape Verde's experiences. I'm tempted to add to what you've said by affinity, but really all you said was the truth. And I think we should be hearing about success stories. A country which at the beginning of its independence in 1975, Cape Verde, is the same age, I think, well, slightly younger, because I think it was the 5th of July that their republic was in fact instituted. But of course, Cape Verde itself has been in existence for centuries, of course, with a very strong culture, which underpins its development. And it's that culture which has meant that its people are so courageous, so patriotic, because that's what's important as well. You have to be patriotic because you may be forced by circumstances to emigrate, so to immigrate here or elsewhere. Emigration is something that was mentioned, but this feeling of patriotism forges national unity, and without that you can't have development either. If you're not conscious of where you come from, even if you're physically on the moon, then you won't be patriotic, and it's vital that we should have that kind of feeling. So we should quote examples such as this. At the beginning of independence, the GDP of Cape Verde was way less than average, and now it's a middle-income country. So you can see the amazing progress made. But it's not just because they've got oil. Not at all. It's because they've got excellent ideas and because they're hardworking. I was fortunate enough, I do apologize for going on like this, but I had the opportunity of going to South Korea years and years ago now. In South Korea. And they always said to us that there's no such thing as a miracle. Developed countries those that have got everything today, they work 7 to 8 hours a day. We work twice that to make up the difference. So that's what needs to be done. You have to invest in people. And that's why I'm so happy with this new concept of the UN on human development. Just because a country has 2-digit growth, it doesn't mean it's the most developed country in the world, because it would be the oil-producing countries that would be in that case. No, you have to invest in people, in education, in health, because for people to actually be hard-working, good citizens, they have to be in good health. And unfortunately, as a result of a certain mindset that used to prevail and which fortunately is becoming less and less followed in the World Bank and in particular in the IMF, because in the past it was almost forbidden to invest in certain sectors that both the World Bank and the IMF saw as being, quote, non-productive sectors, i.e. education and health. So that was a major error that has to be corrected. But when you have, unfortunately, things like the Ebola epidemic, that becomes crystal clear. But it's the last time I'll take the floor, so let me just take one moment to say, quite simply, just how happy we've been in being involved in these festivities. We were very pleased to be able to enjoy the food at lunch from so many different countries. And in less than 60 meters squared, we traveled. I traveled from the Congo to Tuvalu, to the Seychelles, to Madagascar, with these amazing dishes that we were offered. So I would like to thank everybody that has worked so hard to make this celebration a success. And I'd just like to say one word to Mr. Barry, who spoke yesterday, who used to work for the ACP and who I think is in the room, just to say, whilst sharing his concerns, I would like to assure him that we are not as disunited as he fears. On the contrary, we are doing everything we can to maintain solidarity. Solidarity being the core value of our group. It's the yeast which means that the bread rises. And we will continue to maintain that union and to reinforce our solidarity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, as has been said before, moderators always have difficulties. We were behind by 30 minutes. I thought we were going to make those up. We haven't done so. We do have to debate the future of our group, particularly in this session, which is the last one. But I would like, as far as possible, if we could all try to be brief, so that we can have as many people contributing as possible. So I'll now give the floor to the journalist from Mali. You have the floor. From Senegal, and then the ambassador from Mali afterwards, and then I have down Madame Karen.
Please, oui, c'est vous, monsieur.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I must admit I was going to give up my right to speak after what the ambassador of Guinea-Bissau said. Mr. ZONDI, when I was listening to him, I said, perhaps that's then Africa is going to refuse development. In general, and I don't want to repeat what the ambassador has said, our African intellectuals are going to blame developed countries for all of our problems. Although we took part, and I'll give you an example, West Africa had created major air company, Air Africa. It had a good reputation. It flew around the world. And what happened there? It failed. Each small state has its company, small company, and relies on northern countries as the strategic partner in that. So we need to try to think about acting more together. And what's happening now, every state has 3 or 4 universities. We could specialize by regions, for example, according to the wealth of the different regions, what resources they have. But we are each in our own selfishness, thinking we each have to do our own development and develop our own countries. Madame TRAORE, you're a neighbor of Senegal, and Senegal is probably the country where there are most Cape Verdeans after Cape Verde. So President Obama, and as the ambassador said, we have to have strong institutions. Strong leaders, no, but strong institutions, yes. Things have to work. Justice, everything has to work. And everybody needs to feel that public institutions are important. So those were just the few little comments that I wanted to make. The Ambassador of Mali.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm taking the floor for the first time, and I'd like to thank the Secretary General of the ACP, Mr. GOMES, and his entire team for the excellent, perfect organization of this meeting. And I'd like to also extend those congratulations to the former Secretaries General, from the first to the last, and all of Mr. Gomez's predecessors. Plus, I'd also like to congratulate the Secretariat, who has been at the side of the Secretary General in all of this work for 40 years, bringing us to this point. And this afternoon, we were gratified to hear brilliant presentations which have taken us from Wandering onwards. And we've always also heard about underdevelopment, poverty, combating poverty, poverty eradication, and moving this down the matrix towards sustainable development. And then there was one point that I wanted to address, which has already been raised, about Mr. ZONDI's presentation, and that reminded me of what of our professors in international law used to say at the university. He said partnerships between developed and underdeveloped countries are comparable to relations existing between a horseman and his horse. The horseman always gets on top. And I think, really, yes, that's the impression that I have had listening. And when you're talking about dependency, you need to move to interdependency. And as we've heard, the new order that's being called for and that's being developed is something that has come from the less developed countries, and it was an attempt to correct the inequalities that have been identified in earlier programs. And amongst those programs, and I would agree here with Mrs. TRAORE on the question of globalisation, we had the Washington Consensus, which played an extremely important role. The Washington Consensus basically came from the World Bank and the MFI. It was structural adjustments and reforms, and the results are well known, and which damaged developing countries. Fortunately, we then had another program which has changed the approach And now health and education are much more important when it comes to targets for investment. So I just wanted to recall all of that and to agree with the Ambassador that activism is important. And I think the spirit animating the ACP is something that has to reflect that. And I think on our 40th anniversary, I would like to express Mali's support for the ACP process and say that we hope that the next 40 years will be the most successful yet. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
I have the floor.
Ms. Gretton, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Moderator. Thank you. I realized, actually, Ambassador Cabral, I loved your comments about justice and realized I must be younger than you because I thought that Dr. ZONDI was very optimistic in his approach. I also just wanted to say that it has been wonderful to be here for me. It's the first time with ACP, and the South to South is so inspiring to me that I feel that really the ACP is a sacred vessel. And there are not really words for it, but to say that I feel that we are all very blessed to have it in the hands of Secretary Patrick Gomes. So thank you for this wonderful experience.
Thank you, especially for your brevity. You finished?
Yes,
okay, thank you very much. So, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur de Guinée.
The Ambassador of Guinea, you have the floor. Many thanks, Chair. I know what it's like being moderator, and so I'm going to be brief. I wanted to ask Professor TRAORE, I congratulate you on your presentation. I'm happy to see that you direct the Institute of West Africa, and she puts forward Cape Verde as an example for the other countries. I'm interested in the areas the Institute studies because since the Institute exists, the economic and integration aspects sort of also need to have added to them the conflict prevention aspect. Every time one listens to the radio, we hear Human Rights Watch mentioned, we hear International Crisis Group mentioned, we hear specialists of Paris, Toulouse or Bordeaux University, but you never hear African specialists. But they are there and they do very useful research. So having an institute like this in an exemplary country like Cape Verde, I wonder if you've thought about this issue. And it would be good for your institute to be much better known. Actually, it's the first time I've heard about it. But in fact, it has existed for many years. And given what's happening in West Africa, but all over Africa, conflicts, the fight against terrorism, we have the case of Mali, Boko Haram in Nigeria, the problem of elections. Every time there are elections, we always have disturbances or coup d'etat. So I think that could be something where your institute could make a contribution. And then intra-ACP and intra-ECOWAS relations. As the Ambassador Cabral said, we don't need to go abroad to look for examples. There are examples that don't have bauxite, gold, or diamonds. Mauritius, I'm talking about. We've got Botswana as well. Countries that have Mozambique, countries that have made a success without all of those raw materials. You can go to the Caribbean and the Pacific for examples too. So in the future, it would be good for the ACP to concentrate on intra-ACP relations. Technology exchanges, for example, between the countries. We need our northern partners, of course, but let's look at trade between our own countries, visa issues, Mr. Ambassador. That's also a subject that I'd like to raise. It's time for us to remove the need for visas for travel between our different countries. We're always attacking the EU on the issue of visas, but to go from one country to another, for example, for the Parliamentary Assembly in Fiji, there are some small ACP countries that don't need a visa for Fiji, but most of them need them. So why not fight to get rid of those? That would be a great integration victory. I know it's difficult. I know there are sovereignty issues, but given what's happening in the Mediterranean, which is tragic, how we should look at how we can facilitate movement. So I think these kinds of issues will be vital between now and 2020. So how can we increase integration in our own region? Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Tuvalu, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, Excellency. This is my first time to take the floor, and I would like to congratulate ACP, the Secretary General, Dr. GOMES, and his staff for an excellent organization of the 40th anniversary of the ACP Day. And I think in particular the Ambassador of Chad, I think he did a wonderful job in chairing the task force committee, and I thank the committee for preparing and planning it. So thank you for that. A lovely lunch today. Went through, just like what Ambassador from Guinea-Bissau said, went through Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific at lunchtime. Just a few of my comments towards the three speakers. Dr. Williams from South Center, you did mention family, relevance, solidarity, diversity, and I'm speaking as a Pacific small island state, coming from a small island state in the Pacific, Tuvalu, which is considered very, very small and tiny, even within the United Nations structure and family. And you talked about climate change in Bonn. Of course, right now they've been talking about, you mentioned the text gone from 90 pages to 6, which is wonderful. Hopefully everything that small island state members will be able to put in it. And I know they are having a hard time because within AOSIS, Singapore decided to join in already within the alliance of small island states. And that is also sort of an issue of having a big, not small, but well-developed country within the small island states, which are very small. So I understand what you're going through, and I think also that what Ambassador Guinea was talking about is having technology exchange. It has happened for Tuvalu in the past years. We had people from Ghana working in Tuvalu as people in the agriculture department, as legal advisors within the Attorney General's office. It has happened in Tuvalu in the past. And I did not know ACP until I came to work in Brussels, which was not visible in the Pacific region, in the small island state. And I think that needs to be taken up and to expand that type of technology exchange in the Pacific, within Pacific, Africa, and the Caribbean. To Dr. ZONDI, I can relate to some of the issues you brought up, because not all of them, but I think I can. You talked about ideology, yes, because if you don't have something that you want to look forward to, you cannot move forward because you'll be walking in darkness. And I'll give you an example of Tuvalu. Being a very small country, it was once a colony of the United Kingdom, and it was called the Gilbert and Ellice Islands. So the Gilbert was Kiribati, Tuvalu was Ellice Islands. Very of different ethnicity, and so the Tuvaluans decided it is time for us to move away and establish our own country, although we were considered too small by the British to gain independence, but we did. So when we moved, we had to give up. The British say, you either give up, you will lose on the trust fund from the phosphate in Kiribati, you will start from nothing. No, one ship, that's all. You move and you build your own country. So we moved. Well, we cried on the boat, everyone, my parents and everyone. But we traveled, we decided we have to build our nation. So we moved to Tuvalu. And during that time, from one ship, the small trust fund, we built a government. from small houses. Since then, gain independence and build a trust fund, which is known. The Pacific members here can relate to that. Tuvalu is one of the countries in the Pacific that's got a trust fund that is used from interest to administer and to help in the running of the government. And I think that's one thing you, Dr. Gomes, can take on board if you want advice from Tuvalu. So right now there's a Tuvalu Trust Fund, and from there, somehow down the road, near the sea, one of the colleagues, I'm not going to name him, well actually it's my husband, he's in Bonn negotiating for Tuvalu, the climate change, smoking away on the beach with one of his colleagues from Australia and say, why don't we do a trust fund for the outer island communities? We have this national trust fund, but we need to build a trust fund for the small island communities. So from there, we have the National Trust Fund, but we have the Outer Island Community Trust Fund, where annually they come together and say, this is what we want, but we are not going to touch on the trust fund. We will only touch on the interest. And that's how the Outer Island communities have worked throughout many years since that was done. It's true that those trust funds, and that I think that is successful because of the very strong structured governance and system in place, that there's no way those trust funds are going to be brought over. So I think that's one thing I would like to share, and that's from a small island country like Tuvalu, which is very small. So, and I think from Dr. ZONDI, I think that can be done. But I think we still need to have our relationship with our traditional partners, because that's important for us, for countries like Tuvalu. We're very small. We need to have relationship. But I think it's South and South. My term here, I've experienced having a good relationship with my African colleagues, not within the embassies, but within the spouses of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific ambassadors. So I take this opportunity to thank the ACP Secretary for the great support, and to all the embassies for the support they've been giving the Spouses Association for the past years in fundraising. And that's more, but that's cooperation. It's diverse, it's a diverse group, and very, very different in terms of thinking, but it's still the strong ACP, and I think that's unique, that you cannot find anywhere else in the world. You go to the UN, you cannot relate to an African. I go to my own Pacific. Here at ACP, you can relate to the African colleagues, you can relate to your Caribbean colleagues, and you learn from them. So that's some of the things that I will take on board what Dr. ZONDI said about. And for the last speaker, you talked about seats. Of course, the capacity needs to be upgraded in terms of the small. You go to IPA, they come around and they tell you to Tuvalu, small countries, oh, because of you got IUU. Because of your fisheries, you're not going to sign the agreement, the comprehensive one, or because you are being earmarked as one of the countries under the IUU. But for Tuvalu, we don't have the capacity, so we need to look elsewhere. Maybe it's not a priority for us to look at that, and maybe it's one area where the EU can look at. We are going, for small countries, you have this IUU yellow card, but we will assist you to build your capacity to make sure that you upgrade those management systems within the fisheries sector. But that hasn't happened, so I hope some of the countries can help that, because I think that's one area where our traditional partners need to improve on the way they approach us small island states in terms of EPA negotiation. Because fisheries is important. We're not going to give up because of that. On the climate change, ending, I think all the three of you talked about climate change. I think that's important, and I think that's one area where ACP looking forward. The agenda I've listened to yesterday, the Council of Ministers meeting. One of the ministers from Barbados said, we need to be visible, we need to be outside ACP. We need to be known elsewhere. And I think that's one area, and it's already written in most of the papers, and I commend the group, the ACP Secretariat, for building that thinking. And I think it's thinking forward. So I thought I just wanted to take this opportunity to say something, because some of the things that were raised this afternoon clearly reflect on how us Pacific small island states are seen. And I think For us, if you want to be part of ACP, we need to see how ACP is going to look at small countries. Because I'm sitting beside one of the biggest, an African country, South Africa. But that's significant to us. And I think that's important to be maintained and move forward with it. But that has to be clear. And I think for the small countries, that needs to be clear from ACP that if we want to continue to be part of ACP. But I think it's important. So for that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam. Now I give the floor to Her Excellency Mary Falemaka. You have the floor, Madam. Please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. For me, I just wanted to again express our thanks to the Secretary General for the invitation to us. It has been a very enriching 2 days, I must say. Hearing all the presentations that have been held on the reflections of the ACP's 40th anniversary and our reflections on the future of the ACP. I was particularly, having come from Geneva and the WTO, I wanted also to thank the South Center for putting to us candidly the trade issues that could possibly threaten the ACP group. I mean, we can all find ourselves on the margins of the global trading system if the mega RTAs between Europe and the US under the TTIP, a Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership between the Asia-Pacific Rim countries, which consist of the powerhouses in Asia and the Pacific Rim, excluding the Pacific Islands. We are just too small. And the RCEP, the regional close economic partnership within the Asian countries, possibly that will include China. And also the Trade and Investment Agreement, a services agreement, the TISA, all of which are being negotiated outside of the multilateral trading system, outside of the WTO. And I think Dr. Mariama has outlined clearly what this will mean for us in terms of very ambitious rules on trade, whereas in the multilateral trading system, the WTO, it's underpinned by the development aspects, by the need to provide policy space to our governments to introduce policies that will ensure our development. So this is one of the challenges that we will have to manage as an ACP group. But I am thankful that the ACP group is very vocal in Geneva. Today we heard from the President of the UN General Assembly the importance of having a voice at the UN table. And we have a president. In Geneva, the ACP group is, as I said yesterday, is a well-respected group. In fact, I cannot see any agreement in the WTO without the ACP, because we comprise almost half of the WTO, 161 WTO members. And the ACP process basically takes us right through the ministerial conferences. There are ACP meetings leading up to the conferences, at the conference, which supports our members. And I think this is what's lacking also in the WTO. We've said in the last 2 days that there are three important meetings this year. And it's a very important time for global decision-making, and for ensuring coherence within all these three international meetings. There's one on sustainable development, one on climate change, and one on the WTO, the multilateral trading system. We need to ensure that the multilateral trading system, the MC10, and the climate change contribute meaningful decisions to our sustainable development goals. So there is the need for coherence, the need for us to coordinate our action. And if we continue to negotiate in silos, the trade group going off and negotiating trade instruments on their own, the climate change, our climate change experts going off to negotiate climate change on their own, and the Sustainable Development Group on their own, we will not see the link. We will not see the link. So this is why I am happy, Secretary General, that you yourself this morning, in your summary, in the morning session, pointed to the recognition of the need to have the ACP at the table, to strengthen our voice in the UN. These two UN processes on SDG, on climate change, we really need to ensure that the decisions that come from them are meaningful to our development, and they need to ensure synergy. We heard yesterday that from Dr. Mariama that that possibly the Paris conference will lead to some carbon reduction commitments that will affect industrialization. So even at that angle, we will need to, there is a need for coordination. And probably my takeaway today, and probably the thought that I wanted to just leave with colleagues here in the ACP, that we have a strong voice in Geneva, because the ACP is a group, recognized group. We are at the table. We are consulted in every decision that's made in Geneva by all the chairs of the negotiations and also by the Director General. And I think the same process needs to go for the other important global fora that is happening. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for your input. It's time for me to give to the presenters either to comment or to respond to the question that were put. I think most of the debate was mostly comments, but you are also welcome to comment. Maybe I'll start the other way around. So starting with Dr. TRAORE, if you don't mind, please.
Thank you so much, Excellency. Je remercie.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank everybody that took the floor for the very high-level reactions that they've just expressed to our presentations.
Okay, sorry, vai me desculpar, não tinha visto.
I do apologize, I hadn't seen you. And therefore, I would pass the floor to Dr. Barry, who is here with us. And once again, thank you very much for everything that you have done and that you do for this organization. You have the floor, sir.
Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente. Je vous rassure tout de suite, je ne prendrai pas plus d'une...
Thank you. I won't take more than a minute. I just wanted to say to the Ambassador of Guinea-Bissau that I trust him and I trust the Committee of Ambassadors to have the same enthusiasm as their predecessors. You have the responsibility for the ACP group now. We will judge you on your actions based on that will, that determination and that commitment. And I'm convinced that you will meet the challenge. You will rise to the challenge.
Je voudrais simplement vous rappeler...
But I just wanted you to remember the words of a wise man. Work as if you were going to die tomorrow.
Je vous demande, messieurs les ambassadeurs,
through your work you may live forever. I would ask you to dare to create, to innovate, because you're going to be inventing the future of this group. Nobody else can do that. You've created structures. Those are great structures, but the main actors of innovation in ACP are you. It's not people in the structures that you've created. It's you yourselves. And I hope that you are aware of that. And I hope you will offer for the generations to come your work for the ACP. This institution has been working since before 40 years ago, because there were negotiations before the organization was set up. And I would launch a call for you to follow up on the work of the people who from the negotiations to the current day moved this organization forward, and that you could make a film about this, about the founders, so that this could be a reference point, an example of what our history has been. And I'd like to make a suggestion, Secretary General. Don't take away with you just how happy you are about the speeches. We need something specific, something concrete, specific actions. So making that film would be a gift to future generations. You need to defend also the interests of your peoples, of your regions, of the AC group, and I hope that the eternity will guide you in that quest.
Por seus desejos.
Thank you very much for those wishes, Mr. Barry, for our organisation. Dr. TRAORE has the floor. Thank you very much, Excellency. So, having thanked everybody that took the floor and therefore contributed to the debate on the presentations, but various questions were put on the role of our institute in conflict prevention, for example. Ambassador, yes, we are taking this factor into account. Peace and security in West Africa and in the world, quite simply because ECOWAS countries are the epicenter, if you like, of terrorism, jihadist terrorism at the moment. And from the 28th to the 30th of April this year, we organized a conference in Accra and Ghana, and I would echo what you said about our thoughts being with the people of Ghana who just experienced this awful disaster. But we were in Ghana, in Accra, 28th to 30th of April of this year, for a meeting on the subject of the dynamics of peace and security in Western Africa. And that meeting brought together researchers, practitioners, staff from the UN, MUNASMA from Mali, and ambassadors too, because they act as an interface between the different people and parties involved in conflicts. And so we looked at various different areas, from the crisis in Mali to, how can I put this, the maritime conflict, maritime security, piracy, the problems in the Gulf of Guinea linked to maritime security problems, the question of negotiations around peace agreements, and so on and so forth. And we decided at the end of that meeting that we would set up a network for peace and security in Western Africa, which would include other people outside of West Africa. Southern Africa, there were representatives from Europe, from the north, and so on, from China, Latin America. And I'm telling you about this to make it clear that this is an issue that we are very interested in. And again, how can I put this? The crisis in Mali, just to give a concrete example. At the outset, the situation in 2000 in Mali was one which meant that you could actually predict that the crisis was going to happen. But if you go back over time, you'll see that in 1992, at the signature of the peace agreements between the rebel group and the Malian government at the time, it was in transition, it was 91-ish actually. It was before elections of President Connery, and then the national pact that was signed called on the Malian state to withdraw from the north. In other words, the military had to withdraw from the north of Mali and leave, therefore, the people to manage themselves. And then there was the Paris Declaration in 2005, 2006 on aid effectiveness. And that actually said aid should be given directly to the peoples concerned in that region. So there was a withdrawal of the state in terms of authority and security, which made it easier for rebels and jihadists to become established in that area of Mali, and it went unnoticed. I went to Timbuktu in 2004, and the director of the Amaba Institute told me then that there were huge numbers of traffickers and smugglers in the north of the country who'd just turned up, and there wasn't any security. And so I really would thank you for your question, because right from the start, at the meeting I told you about, I was stressing conflict prevention. I said there's no point in setting up a network for peace and security if you're not going to take into account the prevention side. It's the prevention side that was highlighted, therefore, at that meeting. Now, it's true that our institute isn't well known in Africa. The institute has been around since 2010. It was set up on the 28th of June 2010 under a decree law that was passed by the government of Cabo Verde. His Excellency, the Ambassador, Mr. Borges, could say more about that because he was in the government at that point in time when the institute was set up. And why was it set up in Cape Verde? Because in 2005 there was the Management of Social Transformations of UNESCO, which was held on one of the islands, which looked at the question of island states when faced with regional threats. And that's when it was decided that something was lacking when it came to regional integration in Western Africa, and that it needed a think tank, an institute could help politicians and practitioners to speed up regional integration processes. And that was what led to the setting up of our institute with the support of the government, which has supported us seamlessly since then. And I'd also say, Ambassador, that there are all countries of Western Africa represented in the IAO. We also have a partnership with the Germans, with the Center for Integration Research in Germany. I myself studied in Germany, and they give us 1.7 million euros for a 2012 to 2016 program on sustainable regional development in Western Africa and Europe. And it seems to me almost that we're better known in Europe, in northern countries, than in Africa. And in fact, we did conduct a study on renewable energy and energy efficiency with ECRI, which is the specialist ECOWAS energy agency on renewable agencies. Plus, we've also been part of a consortium with English companies on renewable energy too. In addition, we've been working with the Cabo Verde University, thinking about a master's in African regional integration. And here too, I've asked for that master's not just to be covering West Africa. I've suggested it be extended to the whole of Africa, so as to ensure that two of the regional organizations can be a genuine continental organization, because Africa will only be a success if it's united. I apologize for going into so many details, but in Germany, our institute is an institute that the Minister for Foreign Affairs gets in touch with when drawing up his Africa policy. So if you go to our website, you'll find a list of all of our publications, of our researchers. They're online. They can be downloaded free of charge in Portuguese, in English, and in French. So you'll have access to all of the information available about our institute there. Thank you very much. I'd like to pass the floor now to Dr. ZONDI so that he can react or respond. I'd like him to be a little briefer because unfortunately time is not playing in our favour, and the Secretary General is going to have to leave, and I too might have problems. So I would ask for your cooperation, please, Dr. Zondi.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. You should not worry. I hear all the comments about what I had to say. Just one thing is that what I try to convey here is a reason for optimism. The adversity is the reason for optimism. Challenge is the reason why we are optimistic. If the challenges were met, there is no need for optimism, because optimism simply means hoping for a better future. So I am very optimistic, and I think ACP presents a huge opportunity if we understood the meaning of Georgetown. Because I do think that along the way we did lose the meaning of Georgetown Agreement in 1975. If we got back to that and understood what it was meant, I have huge optimism. Now, the one last comment I want to make is that one of the proposals we're making is that you need to strengthen the permanent structure, the permanent secretariat of the ACP if it is to do the things that we want it to do. And those things are, one, that it must become an informal caucus for coordinating positions on trade, development, and other issues, especially in the UN structure, because that voice, as was indicated, is indispensable. Secondly, to become a platform for building internal cohesion, including reminding all of us what the idea was in 1975 that we are yet to achieve, which is develop these countries internally, develop interregional trade, and improve its global position generally. Thirdly, that the ACP must consider putting together a development structure, a structure that is going to coordinate South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation within the ACP. There is enough among ACP members of countries that are already acting as donors elsewhere. They already have technical agencies, they already have the donor agencies. They could be coordinated in a better structure, perhaps a committee of development agencies of members of the ACP, those who have members of it, so that in a coordinated fashion they could better respond to questions of Tuvalu or the Ebola crisis if there had been that in the past. And lastly, that it needs a partnership structure of a sort. A structure such as you see with other organizations where you have important others put into what is called a friends of. So when you have your China, your India, because of the amount of capital they are, if you bring them close and make them feel that whatever they contribute is to their good interest, because you don't consider them not just as funders, but as friends of the institution, they may help to provide quite a lot of funding, as they're doing with the Indian Ocean Rim Association, for example. And very lastly, the idea of an ACP fund is very, very important, especially if that fund does not only just collect funding, but it advises countries about establishing trust funds, and the regions like Africa, the Caribbean, or establishing, however small they are, trust fund. My view is, if we could have countries at least having funding for at least 5% of what they do, you have begun a journey, and that journey is very important. It's much better than depending 100% on another whose interest might change any time. Because we have to face the reality. If Europe continues to decline economically, it cannot really, to be fair to it, continue to carry the burden of everybody else. But if it gets to that point and we are not ready, it will be a problem. I think I was not arguing that we are not to blame for problems, but I was simply saying this is what we see in the world. And my aim was not to blame. I think the duty of scholars is like storytellers, is to see something and say, I see that. I'm not blaming. If I see Europe doing something, I'm not blaming Europe for doing something. I'm seeing Europe doing something. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Dr. Williams. You have
Thank you very much once again, a very rich feast of knowledge and sharing. And I really, truly have learned a lot from both the panelists as from the rest of the day. But first I wanted to just correct Tuvalu. I didn't say from 90 pages to 6, from 90 to 86. So we have a long way to go. And then I want to make a point that when I say that we may have a mitigation agreement, it's not to say that we don't need to do emissions reductions. We do need to do it, especially for small islands because sea level are rising. But it's the context in which it is done. The developed countries developed on cheap fossil fuel. Renewable energy is expensive. If we are to transform our development pathway to renewable energy, we will need finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. We cannot make these commitments without the other side of it. So that is that they have to go hand in hand for us to be able to say we're going to be carbon neutral or zero emissions. Otherwise, it's empty words. We need to know where the source of the implementation will come from. Otherwise, we're trading off poverty eradication, health for that. And we cannot afford it, those of us who have poverty amidst our society. I think your point again about the synergy between trade and the various things that we negotiate and the call for better coordination domestically within our ministries. Foreign Affairs and Environment cannot be the only ones negotiating trade. The Ministry of Commerce, the Ministry of Environment, the Gender Ministry, everybody has to be on board. And we need to end the silo where we have one negotiator negotiating EPA, the other one in WTO, the other one talking about trade in post-2015, and they're not coordinating. So we then have different perspective from the same country on the same exact issue. So issues that people are fighting hard for in Geneva, our counterparts are giving away in New York or other places. We have to stop that. That is on us. That is not the partners. That is our fault, and we need to address those issues. I think I'm going to end by saying, for me, what's important for the ACP as we move in the next year is that it's very conscious that we have to move beyond narrow consideration of trade and investment to look broadly at all of the issues that impact development. And we have to come to a better understanding of how we organically link with existing institution and new institution, both that will come from our region or come from outside. And I think we must begin to reject the narratives that the developed countries and their institutions are putting out about China, India, and Brazil. And we must develop our own strategic analysis and our own narrative about this. Because even as they're telling us negative narrative, they themselves are lining up for Chinese investment and so forth. Not one of them, despite the U.S. pressure, did not join the infrastructural bank. So we have got to be very clear in our analysis of where we want to go and what we want and how we're going to get it. And so the brother talked about constipation of change and the new old order not moving. And we see that in climate change. We hear a narrative about the world has changed since 1992. We need fairness, symmetry, and CBDR is no longer relevant. And yet when you look at the global governance and the institution, you see that the powers that be that control in 1992 still control in 1992, in 2015. So we have to really unpack what it is. Where the struggle, we're in the most dangerous time, I think, because the powers that be feel threatened. And when people feel threatened, they react. And part of that reaction is about maintaining their status quo. So if they have to divide and rule, if they have to fragment, they will do it. But it's our job. We cannot say 10 years from now that we didn't know. We've been through structural adjustment. We've been through many different phases of how imperialism reacts. And we must look at it and examine. And I fully agree with his analysis. We have to face it and look at it. Look at the animal that we're dealing with. And see what it is and say which part of it we want to deal with, when, now, and so forth. And I think ACP is very well ready to take this on. And we are all, from this discussion here today, very well ready to take it on. Thank you so much.
Muito obrigado uma vez.
Once again, many thanks to all the panelists for their contributions, for their thoughts about the future of the ACP group. I think we would all agree that they deserve a great big round of applause, but also that round of applause goes to everybody who took part in the debate this afternoon. It was a very rich debate with a good contribution to our future. So a big round of applause for the panelists and the people who took part.
A terminar, eu gostaria
to wind up, before I give the floor to the Secretary General for his conclusions, I'd like the Minister, Michel Présumé from Haiti, to give us a few thoughts on the forum. Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the Secretary General, too, for having invited us. I'm very happy to be here to take part in these 2 days of work that we've had. I've learned a great deal from the ACP group myself. And from the understanding that the various speakers have shown of the challenges that our countries are facing today. I'm even more pleased that you have been able to work the magic of keeping to the end 3 really excellent speakers who made extraordinary presentations, who've really enlightened us on a number of subjects. And today, more than ever, our responsibility is to dare, to be daring. We need to question where, in contrast to what we used to do, where we questions but then perhaps didn't act with sufficient energy. Now we need to go from questions to action. I recognize that some of the remarks that were made, particularly by the ambassador of Guinea-Bissau, on the presentation of our friend Dr. ZONDI, I recognize those were right, but I was also very impressed by his analysis of the situation, the global situation, and in particular, I thought, you could perhaps correct me, but about the idea of saying to the new ACP Secretary General that the task ahead of him is going to be difficult, and we're going to have to reinvent ourselves. As I said this morning, the ACP has a great deal of experience, a lot of high quality leaders and experts who have done a great deal of work to help us with what we're doing today. And I think they can now reinvent, reorientate themselves to strengthen the work and the partnerships that we have, the partnership with the EU. It's going to continue to be an important partner for us, for the ACP countries. But I think we've all realized there's a need to open up, even in the interests of the EU itself. I think somebody said that we need to provoke reaction. It may be the case that one day the EU will not be able to support us as it has done in the past. There are examples in history which show that this concern is real. So thank you, Dr. ZONDI. I took a great many notes based on your speech. I'm going to continue my thinking about this. I think Dr. Williams very elegantly warned us about a number of decisions that we're going to have to make, which may either facilitate things and help us to develop and attract investment, but which may, if we're not careful, also create greater obstacles to our development. And to Dr. TRAORE, I was very happy that you took the decision to talk about the subject you talked about, because I had an experience in Haiti from '96 onwards, where I was in charge of a body modernizing public institutions. It was a part of the economic reforms that were ongoing at the time. We took this decision at the same time as the Dominican Republic. You can compare the progress they made and the progress we didn't make, and I learned a great deal from that about the need for a win-win partnership, and achieving that is not always easy. When you're a small state, you tend to do business with the countries that you know, and countries that you know feel that they have certain rights. You know, if you're going to make an agreement, you have to make it with this or this company, so you aren't able to open up. And the problem of that is that you can't kind of impose your own rules on those kinds of situations. So you might lose national companies to the benefit of foreign companies, which actually don't bring you anything in yourself. So the example of Cape Verde is very encouraging. I've always thought, as I said this morning, that institutional reform is vital, whether we're talking about the state or para-state institutionals or just private institutions. You need to reform, you need to look to the future and adjust things. It's the only way to keep up with this world which is moving so fast, and where there are such powerful bodies which have no interest in our success necessarily, because often certain people's success has been built on the backs of others, and that's legitimate. So it's our job to set out our objectives, set out the agenda that we want to follow, so that in 10 or 15 years, and as the ambassador to the EU said a little minute ago, so that we can tell our own story. We can see ourselves differently, and we can travel across the world proudly. And people won't say, "Oh, look, it's just a citizen of Haiti." You know, we will be citizens of the world. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Maintenant,
Thank you, Minister. I'll now give the floor to the Secretary-General to close.
First, to thank you for moderating the session, and to thank, if I were to speak for 2 hours, I would still not express all the thanks that is due to all those who have contributed to make this event such a success. And the Secretariat is deeply grateful and appreciates enormously how much you've done. And we give notice that this is only the beginning of several more conversations of this nature, because we want to learn and to be enriched by the insights, experiences, the wisdom that is around this table and is gathered here. The planning task force that was chaired by Ambassador of Chad, and also the team, the Mistress of Ceremony, and those in the Secretariat, we're deeply grateful that this has occurred. We're very happy, too, that, in fact, in the working group report in Section 8, we refer to the Long-Term Development Fund, the Endowment and Trust Fund, and our first informal meeting will be on Tuesday the 23rd at 3 p.m., so we hope Tuvalu will be there. We also want to refer to some words by someone who was present in 1975 when the Georgetown Agreement was signed. The then Foreign Minister of Guyana, now Sir Shridat Ramphal, referred to this in this way. The second compelling lesson is how critical it was to pool our resources, political, economic, and intellectual, in negotiating with countries beyond ourselves, globally in Europe, in the Hemisphere, and within the Caribbean. As regards the Lomé negotiations, the process of unification, for such it was, added a new dimension to the Third World's quest for economic justice through international action. Its significance, however, derives not merely from the terms of the negotiated relationship between the 46 ACP states and the European Economic Community, but from the methodology of unified bargaining, which the negotiations pioneered. Never before had so large a segment of the developing world negotiated with so powerful a grouping of developed countries, so comprehensive and so innovative a regime of economic relations. It was a new and salutary experience for Europe. It was a new and reassuring experience for the ACP states. Mr. Ramphal would have wanted to be with us today, but he could not. And he concludes, 40 years later, today as you celebrate your birthday, that lesson retains its validity. Unity of purpose and action remains the touchstone of ACP's meaning and success. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us until this late hour. And to end the show, we have dancers from Tuvalu. Please give them a warm welcome.
Thank you, Excellency.
They'll be followed by boys from Fiji. Let's also give them a hand. They'll walk in later. Thank you. Please go.
I'm going to the airport right now. Yeah, I'm going to Rome.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Non, mais je suis pas climatisation. Ils ont laissé juste quand je suis mauvaise c'est ça, moi aussi. Merci beaucoup,
I will. Oh, you gave me already. You gave me, yes. I titled correctly.
Yeah, okay. No problem.
Just a minute, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to start shortly. Just a little minute.
Ma chère,
professeur, le master, voilà, le programme de master.
Who is sitting here from Secretariat? Someone from Secretariat should pass me. Dr. TRAORE.
Talk with you again soon. I'm going to Cabo, okay?
I gave you my card. Could you please send me your presentation?
I will.
Ladies and gentlemen, with that wonderful, energetic performance from the Pacific, I would like to wish you a very good evening. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much, and happy birthday, ACP. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for also the artists and everyone. Happy birthday once again. Feliz aniversario ao grupo ACP.
Excellency. Happy anniversary. Thank you, sir.
Yes. We do well in those countries. So there is something, oh, that's it.
Yeah.
There's something again?
No.
Yes. Where is it coming? Should we go there? Where's the best background? Maybe here.
What a beautiful baby. Maybe up here by the AC.
Alors on vit chaque jour comme le dernier. Et vous feriez pareil si seulement